People love to point out how bad film is for the environment, the chemicals, the paper, the water use. I wanted to know if they were actually right, so I did a deep dive and it led me somewhere I didn't really expect. In fact, when I first started researching this, I'll be honest, I thought I already knew the answer. I figured one was just clearly worse for the environment than the other was. But the deeper I went, looking at the materials, the energy use, the waste, and the long-term impact, it turned out to be a lot more complicated than I thought. So in this video, we're gonna break down the environmental impact of film versus digital photography. So if you've ever wondered which format is truly more sustainable, this is the deep dive that you've been waiting for. So when we talk about the environmental impact in photography, most of the focus tends to be on what's happening like after the picture's taken. Chemicals, batteries, cloud storage, and even printing. But the environmental story actually starts earlier than that with the gear itself and how it was produced. Digital cameras, whether it's a mirrorless, digital SLR, or even a smartphone, these rely on complex global supply chains. They require lithium, cobalt, rare earth minerals, high-grade plastics, glass, processors, and batteries. And all of these materials have to be mined in environmentally intensive ways and then shipped around the world to be refined and assembled. And because digital tech evolves so quickly, a lot of these devices are replaced every few years. That means this manufacturing cycle starts over and over again with each new camera body, lens system, or smartphone upgrade.
Ooh, a piece of candy. Ooh, a piece of candy.
Now, if we look at film cameras on the other hand, they're a bit of an outlier in today's tech landscape. Very few are manufactured new anymore, and most people in the film photography community are using gear that's essentially made 20, 30, even 50 years ago. These cameras were often built with mostly mechanical parts, no reliance on sensors or electronics, which means they're not only durable, they're also serviceable and reusable. Of course, film photography still requires manufacturing. Film, paper, and chemistry all have their own footprint, but when it comes down to the gear itself, the impact is significantly reduced by the fact that it already exists. The takeaway isn't that one format is universally better, it's that the manufacturing footprint of digital gear is ongoing and high, while the footprint of film gear is largely historical and limited to existing tools still in use. And just the fact that a global community is still making meaningful work with cameras built half a century ago, that's not just impressive, it's rare in today's world of fast tech cycles.
You know, I built this entire system because I remember what it was like being really frustrated and alone, not getting good results in my darkroom, ultimately just wasting time, money, and paper. So I spent well over a year building Unlock the Darkroom. And this isn't just a course, it's an entire process and methodology that goes through and is guaranteed to get you good results from start to finish in a creative, efficient workflow. So really, this is everything I wish I had had when I was going through these struggles. It's a clear path. It helps understand the right tools to get these amazing prints, and it's a supportive community of others working through this together. So if you're just sick of inconsistent results and it feels like you're guessing at most or all of the darkroom process, you don't have to do this alone. Just click the link in the description below. It's the clarity and control you've been missing in your darkroom.
Environmental impact isn't just about what something is made of, it's about how long it lasts. So if you can use the same gear for 10, 20, or even 50 years, this spreads out the impact of manufacturing across every image you make. So let's look at longevity. Most digital camera bodies, including digital SLRs, mirrorless bodies, and smartphones, have a shorter usable lifespan, not because they're poorly made, but because the pace of innovation is fast. Sensors improve, autofocus gets better, albeit I don't really see how it can get a whole lot better than it is now, but still file sizes are increasing, and just over time, older hardware just can't keep up with the new workflows or new software requirements. So for professionals or even serious hobbyists, this often means upgrading our equipment every few years. And this is not because our cameras are are broken or our computers aren't working, it's just because they become more limiting. And even though digital gear can often be resold and repurposed, a huge majority of it just ends up collecting dust and is e-waste in landfills. Film gear, on the other hand, tells a completely different story. Many film cameras are fully mechanical, no sensors, not even batteries, no firmware. That means fewer things can fail and many are still working decades after they were built. But here's what's interesting. The community is still actively using them. These aren't just collector's items, they're working tools, keeping it out of the landfills. Of course, this doesn't mean film gear is always the better choice, especially if you need digital speed, convenience, or simply modern features. But if we're talking about gear longevity and how long a tool can stay in use without needing, say, replacement, analog cameras have a strong case for being the more sustainable option. Next, let's look at the environmental cost of actually making an image. Not the camera, not the storage, just the act of taking and producing the photo. This is where things get a little bit more technical, but it's important because this is the part that we actually repeat over and over again. So this makes a huge impact on the environment. So with digital photography, the energy cost per image is low, but it's definitely not zero. Every time you shoot, your camera uses electricity to power the sensor, processor, and screen. Then there's storage on SD cards, hard drives, backup drives, NAS systems, and often the cloud. And everything in the cloud is gonna use like data centers, which are powered by like super energy intensive systems. So I can tell you firsthand from running a professional studio for the last 15 years that having redundant RAIDs and NAS systems and just being mandatory that I have a copy backed up in the cloud as well and in multiple locations, this takes a lot of energy. For the average photographer, it might not be so intense, but it still all adds up. Add to that, editing on a computer adds another layer of power use. And while each of these steps seems small, they happen across millions and millions, maybe billions of images. So the more we shoot and store, the more energy we use. It's as simple as that. So on the flip side, film photography uses physical materials. Each frame of film uses celluloid, silver halide crystals, and chemical processing. So when printing, you also use paper, developer, stop bath fixer, and often different toners. Some of those chemicals are hazardous and some of the processes are very water intensive. So where digital consumes energy, film consumes material, and both have an environmental cost. So the real difference is in how those costs scale. So digital photography has a very low cost per image, but a large carbon footprint up front, and encourages high volume shooting, which adds to the impact over time. Film has a higher material cost per image since each frame requires a physical negative and often a physical print, but it also tends to encourage more deliberate shooting, which naturally just limits your output more. So neither system is zero impact. One leans on electricity and infrastructure, the other on chemicals and materials. And both depend heavily on how you actually work. So how much you shoot, how you process, and whether or not you actually print your work. Next, the biggest critique of film photography is definitely the use of chemicals, and understandably so. But digital photography creates waste too, just a different kind. So let's compare the two side by side, chemical waste from analog versus electronic waste from digital. So with film photography, the biggest concern is chemical waste. Black and white processing uses developers, stop bath fixer, and like I mentioned, sometimes toners or even bleaching agents. Many of these contain compounds like silver thiosulfate, hydroquinone, or ammonium salts, which if poured just directly down the drain, they can be harmful to aquatic life and water systems. Some chemicals are considered hazardous and require special handling or disposal depending on your local regulations. Now, most home darkroom users don't generate like large volumes of waste, but poor disposal habits or just lack of awareness can magnify the impact over time. Now, on the other side, digital photography creates very little direct waste per photo, but when digital gear is damaged, outdated, or discarded, it becomes e-waste, and that comes with its own huge list of challenges. E-waste contains heavy metals, flame retardants, and other toxic components. It's often difficult and expensive to recycle properly, and a significant portion of global e-waste still ends up in landfills or just informal processing sites in developing countries where it can contaminate air, soil, and water. So how do they then stack up? Film waste is continuous and tied to the act of developing and printing. But this is all relatively manageable, especially if you follow safe disposal practices or use less toxic alternatives. Digital waste, on the other hand, is a bit more delayed. It builds up at the end of a device's life. But when that lifespan ends, it's hard to deal with and has long-term consequences if it's mishandled. So the big difference is visibly, film waste is it's obvious, right? You can see the chemicals, smell them, measure them. Digital waste is a bit more hidden and often marginalized because of that. But both matter and both require responsibility on the part of the photographer. Now, water is one of the most overlooked parts of photography's environmental footprint, especially in analog workflows. It's used for rinsing film, washing prints, and diluting chemistry. But it's not just about how much water we use, it's also about what actually goes into the water. A single darkroom session can use several gallons, even more if archival washing is done, of like fiber-based paper. Then we really have to talk about chemical runoff. Spent fixer contains silver, and if these things are just poured directly down the drain without treatment, they can harm water systems and wildlife. In digital photography, water use is very minimal by comparison. Most digital workflows don't really require direct water at all. However, water still is used indirectly in digital ecosystems, like manufacturing of electronics and then cooling systems for large data centers where photos are stored and backed up. Now, these industrial processes can use millions of gallons of water, though it's often recycled internally and regulated. Still, the scale of the infrastructure matters, especially in more water-stressed regions. So here's how it breaks down. Film photography uses water directly, and how much you use depends on your printing habits, archival practices, and how careful you are to manage your own workflow. Digital photography, on the other hand, uses water more indirectly, mainly during the manufacturing of electronics and cloud infrastructure. The difference basically is visibility. In film, you can see the water running, you're connected to it. In digital, it happens behind the scenes, but at a much larger scale. So neither is water free, but both put pressure on the shared resource in different ways. One small and local, and the other more industrial and global. So every tool eventually just reaches the end of its life. A broken hard drive, a camera body that stops working, or a laptop that just can't be repaired anymore. Now, in film photography, most of the waste is consumable. Spent film, test prints, and paper scraps, used developer, fixer, and wash water. While some silver can be recovered from fixer, most darkroom materials aren't recyclable through traditional municipal systems. Disposing of these materials often falls entirely on the photographer, and there's little infrastructure in place to really help them along. Now, digital photography, on the other hand, generates e-waste at the end of the device's life. This is cameras, sensors, batteries, SD cards, hard drives, and all your different screens. E-waste can be recycled, but it's pretty complicated. Devices need to be disassembled, sorted, and processed properly. Many contain valuable materials like copper, gold, and even rare earth minerals, but improper handling of these devices can release hazardous substances like lead or cadmium. And it's a real bummer, but global e-waste recycling rates remain rather low, with a majority of, or large percentage of this waste either ending up in landfills or exported to countries with less regulation. Now, both systems have serious end-of-life challenges, just in different ways. With film, it's harder to recycle, often personal scale, and just depending on the photographer's habits. Digital waste is just more industrial in nature, and it's potentially recyclable, but it requires specialized infrastructure, and it's rarely handled perfectly. Neither system has a clean exit by any means, and both do rely on individual responsibility and access to proper disposal methods. And this is gonna help minimize their long-term environmental impact. Okay, so what does this all mean? We've looked at 7 different factors: manufacturing, longevity, per image impact, chemical versus e-waste, water use, and just end-of-life disposal. And the truth is, both digital and film photography have real environmental costs, just in different ways. So let's talk honestly about what this all means, not just in theory, but in actual use and in practice. There's absolutely no such thing as zero impact photography, right? Film uses physical resources, paper, chemicals, and water, usually on a per print or per roll basis. And this tends to put more direct pressure on local systems, but it's highly effective by how responsible each photographer works. Now, digital removes many of those daily physical costs, but it creates its own footprint through manufacturing, energy use, and especially e-waste. The scale may be invisible, but it's global and it's definitely growing. And in both cases, the burden really isn't just on the gear or even the process. It's really on us as photographers. It's how we choose to shoot, how we choose to store, print, and how we dispose of the tools we use in the end. So what it boils down to is that no format is perfect, but every format can be used responsibly. So whether you shoot digital, film, or both is irrelevant. You can make conscious choices to reduce your footprint. And what you can do is shoot with more intention, maintain and reuse any gear, process chemicals responsibly, recycle whatever you can, and avoid unnecessary upgrades or just storage bloat in general. Because in the end, sustainability in photography is not about what you shoot. It's actually more about how you work, and when you take full ownership of your craft, the tools, the process, and the outcome, that is what makes the biggest difference. So when I started researching this, I'll be totally honest, I thought I knew the answer. I assumed film had to be quite a bit worse for the environment, just from the chemicals used, the water use, the physical waste, and that's just what I've always heard. But once I started digging deeper, not just into darker materials, but also the energy behind like cloud storage and the average photographer's upgrade cycle, the picture it got a lot more complicated. And what I found is that there's really no clear winner, because both film and digital have clear environmental costs, and both give us the chance to be responsibility in the way we work. And that's why as a photographer and father, I'm trying to do my part. I've created a guide inside my community and the Unlock the Darkroom workshop to help students be more responsible with chemical disposal and work more safely in the darkroom. And this includes simple steps for proper disposal and environmental care. Because this isn't about being perfect, it's about being aware, making informed decisions, and supporting each other to do better. And if you'd like to learn more about the workshop and the community, just check the link in the description below. Thanks for watching, and more importantly, thanks for caring enough to ask these kinds of questions. And if you're keeping score, by the way, digital did come out slightly ahead in this breakdown, but the real takeaway is that both systems have an impact and both give us the power to do better. I'll see you in the next one.